Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 9, beginning in verse 8, and going all the way through the end of chapter 10 in our continuing study of the Old Testament prophets. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 8 begins, "The Lord sends a message against Jacob, and it falls on Israel." Now, in the previous part of this chapter, we'd seen a message of hope for the future. And it begins with those tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun, the northern part of Israel, how they're going to see a great light, and a child will be born, and a son will be given. And that's a messianic expectation. But now we move from hope in the future to judgment in the present. And so there's a message coming against Israel, against Jacob. It falls on Israel. Notice two different ways of saying the same thing. And it's going to be a message of judgment. Verse 9, "And all the people know it, that is, Ephraim and the inhabitants of Samaria, asserting in pride and in arrogance of heart." Notice what they're saying. This is what they're saying. It's not true, but they're saying it. "The bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with smooth stones. The sycamores have been cut down, but we will replace them with cedars." Yes, the judgment of God came and is coming, but that's okay. We'll just rebuild. We can get past this. And that's at least the way they're envisioning it. In their pride and in their arrogance, they're saying, "Oh yeah, God's going to judge. He's going to spank us, but then we'll be okay." No, they are grossly underestimating the judgment of God. Verse 11, "Therefore the Lord raises against them adversaries from Rezin and spurs their enemies on." The Arameans on the east. That's who Rezin is. That's with its capital in Damascus, and the Philistines on the west. Notice that Israel is seen surrounded by enemies, and they devour Israel with gaping jaws. In spite of all this, his anger does not turn away, and his hand is still stretched out, not in grace, but in judgment. And now we're going to see this phrase again and again and again. This is going to be the refrain, where God has sent Aram against Israel. He has sent the Philistines to devour. And in spite of all of these negative things of opposition, of judgment against Israel, in spite of this, Israel has not turned back. But also notice his anger does not turn away. That's God's anger. His hand is still stretched out in judgment. In other words, you've seen judgment. You haven't seen anything yet. There's more to come. The worst is yet to come. Verse 13, "Yet the people do not turn back to him who struck them, nor do they seek the Lord of hosts." Even though he is judged, you think, okay, remember back in the days of the judges, where the people would turn away from God, and then God would judge, and then the people would turn back to God. And there's missing that component. The people have not turned back. Verse 14, "So the Lord cuts off head and tail from Israel." You say, well, what's that? We're going to see it in just a second. Both palm branch and bulrush in a single day. The head is the elder and the honorable man. In other words, the good leader is cut off. And the prophet who teaches falsehood is the tail. Notice the leaders, whether the good leaders or the bad leaders, they're getting cut off. Imagine this animal with both its head and its tail cut off, both the good and the bad. And Israel is just turning into a mess. Verse 16, "For those who guide this people are leading them astray, and those who are guided by them are brought to confusion." The leaders are leading, but they're not. They're being cut off. They're not leading in a good way. Remember how Jesus talks about how the one who's you're guided by blind leaders, and the blind leading the blind, and they'll both fall into the pit. And that's what's taking place here. In fact, Jesus might be referencing this, borrowing this language when he says that. Verse 17, "Therefore the Lord does not take pleasure in their young men, nor does he have pity on their orphans or their widows. For every one of them is godless and an evildoer, and every mouth is speaking foolishness." In spite of all this, here's the refrain again, in spite of all this, his anger does not turn away, and his hand is still stretched out. So that's not the end. It's going to continue. Verse 18, for wickedness burns like a fire. It consumes briars and thorns. It even sets the thickets of the forest aflame, and they roll upward in a column of smoke. This is firefighting language of a fire that's sweeping through a forest. We're going to see this forest theme going through this chapter and into the next one. By the fury of the Lord of hosts, the land is burned up, and the people are like fuel for the fire. No man spares his brother. They slice off what is on the right hand, but are still hungry. They eat what is on the left hand, but they are not satisfied. Each of them eats the flesh of his own arm. Notice this is almost like do-it-yourself cannibalism. They're gobbling up themselves with their wickedness. Verse 21, Manasseh devours Ephraim, and Ephraim Manasseh. These are tribes eating themselves. And together they are against Judah, which we've seen that in the past. We've seen Israel coming against Judah, and Judah coming against Israel. In spite of all this, his anger, and here's the refrain again, in spite of all this, his anger does not turn away, and his hand is still stretched out. The judgment continues. And notice, they are part of their own judgment. They are bringing themselves, not just because of their sinfulness, but they're actually doing it to themselves. They're actually doing the judgment against themselves. We come to chapter 10, verse 1. It still continues. Woe to those who enact evil statutes, and to those who constantly record unjust decisions, these are the lawyers, so as to deprive the needy of justice and rob the poor of my people of their rights, so that widows may be their spoil, and that they may plunder the orphans. This is what the evil of Israel is doing. This is social injustice. Verse 3, now what will you do in the day of punishment, and in the devastation which will come from afar? To whom will you flee for help, and where will you leave your wealth? Nothing remains but to crouch among the captives, or fall among the slain. And here's that final refrain. In spite of all this, his anger does not turn away, and his hand is still stretched out. That is stretched out in judgment. Now, we've seen these judgments against Israel. We've seen them in 4 refrains. We saw all 4 refrains, chapter 9, verse 8, all the way up to chapter 10, verse 4. Now, we're going to see judgment against Assyria. You say, wait a second, I thought Assyria was the one bringing the judgment. Yes, but now the one that's the tool of judgment, he's not the judge. Assyria is not the judge, but Assyria is the tool of God's judgment. Now Assyria will also be judged. And so in verse 5, woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger and the staff in whose hands is my indignation. See, Assyria was the tool that God used to bring judgment against Israel. Verse 6, I send it against a godless nation. Who's the godless nation? Well, that was Israel. And commission it against the people of my fury to capture booty and to seize plunder and to trample them down like mud in the streets. And Assyria was very good at that. And so here's Assyria coming against, of course, they'd come against Aram, but we're not concerned with that. Notice especially against Israel. And eventually they're going to try to take out Judah too. And notice verse 7, yet it does not so intend. Assyria wasn't doing this because God sent them. Assyria was doing this as far as their motives. They were doing it to get plunder. So it does not so intend, nor does it plan so in its heart, but rather its purpose. It is its purpose to destroy and to cut off many nations. Assyria was doing this for their own purposes, but as they were doing this for their own purposes, they were a tool in the hand of God. For it says, are not my princes all kings? Is not Calno like Carchemish, or Hamath like Arpad, or Samaria like Damascus? I've conquered some of these. I'm going to conquer more. And Assyria is continuing to say this, as my hand has reached to the kingdoms of the idols, whose graven images were greater than those of Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not do to Jerusalem and her images, just as I've done to Samaria and her idols. And so Assyria is thinking, okay, I took out Samaria and they couldn't stand against me. I'm going to take out Judah and they can't stand against me. And of course, when we get to the middle section of Isaiah, we're going to find out, no, Judah can't stand against you, but God can. And God is going to judge Assyria. in first one swoop there, and ultimately God will judge Assyria by bringing other nations against Assyria. Chapter 10, verse 12, so it will be that when the Lord has completed all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the pomp of his haughtiness. The king of Assyria is actually going to come down against Judah and say, hey, God sent me, and so therefore you might as well give up. And God's going to say, you know, they're speaking, I had used them in the past, but not in this instance. Verse 13, for he has said, by the power of my hand and by my wisdom I did this. This is what Assyria is saying. For I have understanding, and I have removed the boundaries of the peoples and plundered their treasures, and like a mighty man I brought down their inhabitants. Wait a minute, God was the one who gave Israel into their hands. And this is still Assyria speaking. And my hand reached to the riches of the people like a nest. And as one gathers abandoned eggs, I gathered all the earth. And there was not one that flapped its wings or opened its beak or chirped. You know, I was like the fox in the hen house. I was just coming and taking whatever I desired, and I desire more. Verse 15, is the axe to boast itself over the one who chops with it? Now, see, Assyria was the axe. This pagan nation, Assyria. And yet Assyria cannot boast to the Lord because the Lord is the one using Assyria as the tool. He's using Assyria as the axe. Is the saw to exalt itself over the one who wields it? That would be like a club wielding those who lift it, or like a rod lifting him who is not of wood. You know, it's one thing to be the tool. It's another thing to face the wielder of the tool. And so verse 16, therefore the Lord, the God of hosts, will send a wasting disease among his stout warriors. And under his glory a fire will be kindled, remember this fire theme again, like a burning flame, and the light of Israel, now it's not talking about Israel doing it, it's the light of Israel. In other words, it's the God of Israel. The light of Israel will become a fire, and his Holy One a flame, and it will burn and devour his thorns and his briars in a single day. Judgment is coming to the tool of judgment. Verse 18, and he will destroy the glory of his forest. And here's that forest fire theme again, but notice who's getting burned this time. And of his fruitful garden, both soul and body, and it will be as when a sick man wastes away, and the rest of the trees of his forest will be so small in number that a child could write them down. Notice the picture, the imagery is of a forest just being swept away. And so we saw judgments against Israel in 4 refrains. Now we've seen judgment against Assyria. But in the closing verses, we're going to see the promise of a remnant, not in Assyria, but in Israel. Verse 20, now in that day the remnant of Israel and those of the house of Jacob who have escaped will never again rely on the one who struck them, but will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. There's coming a day when there will be a remnant. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God, and they will recognize God's might and God's glory and God's honor. Verse 22, for though your people, O Israel, may be like the sand of the sea, only a remnant within them will return. A destruction is determined, overflowing with righteousness, a destruction that takes the many out, but a small remnant is promised. For a complete destruction, one that is decreed, the Lord God of hosts will execute in the midst of the whole land. Just because there's a remnant, don't think of that now. That's going to be later. And first, the people will be removed from the land, but there will be a remnant that can return. Therefore, thus says the Lord God of hosts, O my people who dwell in Zion, do not fear. Now notice, the people who dwell in Zion isn't the northern kingdom of Israel. This is the people in the southern kingdom of Judah. Do not fear the Assyrian who strikes you with a rod and lifts up his staff against you the way Egypt did, for in a very little while my indignation against you, and there is judgment and indignation against the southern kingdom of Judah because they have sinned as well. But my indignation against you will be spent, and my anger will be directed to their destruction. The Lord of hosts will arouse a scourge against him, like the slaughter of Midian at the rock of Oreb, And his staff will be over the sea, and he will lift it up the way he did it in Egypt. Remember what happened with the Red Sea in Egypt. Verse 27, so it will be on that day that his burden will be removed from your shoulders, and his yoke from your neck, and the yoke will be broken because of fatness. I'm going to take them out because of their arrogance. Not because of what they did to Israel. I sent them there for that. But they became arrogant in their attitude. And so the tool of judgment becomes judged. In verses 26 through 32, not going to read all these, but you have a number of place names, Ayath and Migron, Mishmash, Geba, place names that are mentioned that are signs of this judgment. You go all the way to Gibim and Nob, and then you close with the mountain of the daughter of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem. And it comes to there, and Assyria is allowed to go to there, but no further. And God will deliver Zion, the hill of Jerusalem. So in verse 33, behold, the Lord, the God of hosts, will lop off the boughs with a terrible crash. You say, well, what's being lopped off? Is this Assyria? Is this the northern kingdom of Israel? And in a way, it's sort of a picture of both. Even, remember, even the southern kingdom of Judah saw a lot of its cities being destroyed. And those who are lofty will be abased. He will cut down the thickets of the forest with an iron axe, and Lebanon will fall by the mighty one. So you have all of this judgment and destruction. And this brings us to the end of the chapter. But in the next verse, in chapter 11, as we open up, we're going to see a shoot springing from the stem, from this lopped off forest that's been completely obliterated, where there are only stumps that are remaining. A shoot, a twig, a sprout will sprout forth. And we'll look at that next time.